And also fake news. I guess what we can start off and do is just have a quick introduction of each of our journalism professionals here, and then have a few starter questions, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I'm Paul Anger, 72. I guess I'm one of the pioneers. Went on to work at the paper for Central Wisconsin, the Oshkosh Daily Northwestern back then, Fond du Lac Reporter, Miami Herald, a little bit in Washington, D.C. after the 9/11 attacks, working for Night Ritter News Service, and then Des Moines Register as editor, and then retired 3 years ago as editor and publisher of the Detroit Free Press. And I will tell you that I thought I got a great education in 1972, and everything that I can see right now going on here at UWO makes me believe that you are really, really well served, folks. So I'm really glad to be here.
My name is Barb Benish. I was Barb Schmitz, and I graduated in 1983, also with a journalism degree from UW-Oshkosh. I worked as city editor for the Northwestern, and can I tell the grave story real quick? Okay. Angie was one of my reporters back then, and we had a coroner at the time who was drinking a lot, and it was very apparent that he might have maybe gave the wrong reason for death on a number of cases. Let's just put it that way. So Angie and I, we could get the DA to talk if we would have a name. So every morning before we started work, about 6 a.m., Angie and I would walk through all of the local cemeteries looking for graves that had been dug up, that people had died years ago. And we actually did find one. The coroner had said he died of drowning, and they exhumed his body, and he actually died of a bullet to his head, just a slight mistake. So that was our daily routine for a long time. So that was kind of fun. Today I also teach journalism here, which is fun. I'm the internship coordinator, the new executive secretary of NewsPA, which is the Northeastern Wisconsin Scholastic Press Association, and I am the new advisor for the Advanced Titan, as well as I freelance. So I'm busy.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Jim VandeHei, and I graduated in '94. And I guess I had a degree in political science and journalism. I've been out in Washington, D.C. since I graduated. I worked for the Brilliant News while I was here, the Oshkosh Daily Northwestern on the sports page. I was the guy you were reading when you wanted to know what happened in high school wrestling. I moved out to D.C. I worked at a small publication called New Fuels Report, then worked at Roll Call, and then started working covering politics, both Congress and then the presidency for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And then 10 years ago, sort of shifted and became, I guess, an entrepreneur and started a company called Politico. I did that for a decade, and then just recently started a company called Axios, where we cover politics, technology, business, media, and I've been doing that for 18 months, but I still consider myself a journalist, and I still consider myself a Titan. So.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you guys. So before we get into deeper conversations about fake news, misinformation, I felt like it would be a good idea just to level set and lay out some context. So I guess, Jim, if you could hop in on this, what is fake news?
It's news that is fake. How's that? I mean, it's like a cancer on society is what I think fake news is. I think it's a much bigger problem than we even can realize at this point. Largely because there's so many differentiations between fake news, right? There's truly fake news, there's fake-ish news, there's conspiratorial news, there's news that's just emotional and meant to sort of get you to do probably bad things with your time. In its worst manifestation, it can influence an election. That I think people still don't realize that the Russians, by spending only a few rubles, could probably tip a lot of votes in a lot of states because Facebook is built to allow people to sort of give you more of what you want. So if you hated Hillary, you got more Hillary hatred. If you hated Trump, you got more Trump hatred. emotion drives votes, and so there's no doubt that fake news probably had some big effect on the election. And it's a cancer because if you look at polls now, anywhere from 50 to 60% of people don't believe what our industry writes. And that's a huge problem. And you might be a conservative in the room and say, well, you're damn right. Like, we shouldn't believe a thing that you write. You're wrong. Like, I'm sorry. Like, there is, I'm a pro-truth person. Like, there are facts, and there are some stories that are just stories. And if we get to a point where we live in two different tribes and we don't trust each other, we are screwed. We really are. Because at some point, you think about the last 2 years, as crazy as the last 2 years feel, they're probably two of the best years in the history of humanity. By almost every measure, you have peace, you have prosperity, you have low joblessness, you have growth in every single developing economy around the world. You have synchronized growth. Almost never happens. Something bad will happen. And when bad things happen, it's especially when you need the media. It's especially when you have to believe in truth. Because you need the public to rally around a certain concept. You need them to understand the facts on the ground. And when you chip away at truth, you really do start to hammer away at democracy. I feel very passionately about that.
You guys have anything to add?
I agree. The one thing that you didn't mention, it's fake news is not the fact that President Trump doesn't like what we're writing, and that's not fake news. That's just him opposed to us telling the truth.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction because when you talk about fake news, that could encompass a whole range of things from stuff made up or photoshopped or just false on the internet. But really the marketing term, and it really is a marketing term that Donald Trump came up with. Fake news is basically what he doesn't like. So the more we apply fake news across the spectrum of things that can show up that aren't really true or whatever, there is real false news, and then there is the marketing term fake news. And I think that's the danger, is all of this getting mooshed together under this fake news label. And it's similar to what he came up with for Ted Cruz, Lion Ted, right? Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas. You know, this was an invention that he came up with, basically to label what he didn't like was being written about him. The vast majority accurate, not 100%, but the vast majority accurate. But it didn't matter whether it was accurate or not. And that to me is a danger, and I think it's going to take us a while to recover from this, regardless of what happens in 2020.
So, fake news, obviously, it's really started to trend. What was one of your first experiences with fake news, and you actually realized it was starting to become a bigger problem?
Which?
And I guess, Barb, you'd like to start.
I was teaching writing for the media when President Trump was elected into office. And I'm seeing a student who's already laughing. I try not to let my political views get into it, but we would start almost every class with me nearly in tears about the things, you're nodding your head too, about the things he was saying about this profession that I hold so true and dear to me. And our program does not train reporters to go out there and create fake news. We really stress this, it's gotta be right. And so, almost every class there was another tweet, another example. The alternative news, the quote that became so famous from, I can see her, I can't think of her, you know who I mean, but yeah. So to me that was, and it all started with the stupid size of the inauguration crowd. To me, reflecting on it as a teacher, teaching these very entry-level reporters, it was just disheartening. It was, I felt like crying some days.
Again, it goes to your point about, fake news is a marketing term. So when you say, when's your first contact with it, I think you got to go way back. I think, back to like the mid '90s when politics really starts to become much, much more combat sport, and you start to see cable TV take off, and so you start to now, if you have a certain view, you now had a place to go to get it reinforced. Well, carry that forward, then you hit social media. I think once Facebook and then Twitter take off, you start to see sort of this natural tendency towards tribalism. And I think the precursor to fake news was people just not believing real news. So whatever you want to put on that term. My personal belief is that when Facebook takes off and Twitter takes off, we as humans were not actually equipped to deal with the toy that we were given. Because what happens is what's happened on Facebook. Like when you think about it, if pre-Facebook, if you had something stupid on your mind, like you might be able to like yell it in your neighborhood, you might be able to scream at the TV. Well, now you can put that stupid thing on Facebook or Twitter, and you're going to find another 100 people who applaud you or fan you or friend you. And guess what happens when people applaud you and friend you? You do more of it. You do it louder, and you do it more in a more extreme way. And you want more people who feel the way that you do. So the combination of cable plus social pulls us into these bubbles, and they are bubbles. So many people that I know and that I respect, who I consider very well educated, very smart, they will tell me things that they think are truth that are just patently full of shit. Like they're just not real. That is a huge issue. And so when you get to fake news, it is a marketing term, and it's once you start using it, the being able to utilize, again, Facebook in the election to be able to move false information ended up being like that's when it really came into stark relief that like we might actually have a fundamental threat to democracy on our hands, not just a sort of an inconvenience that some people like Fox and some people like MSNBC. And by the way, you're no closer to putting that genie back in the bottle today than you were after the last election. All of the things, yes, we might be better at detecting whether or not the Iranians or Russians are trying to propagate fake news, but it's really easy to still spread fake news or emotional news or propaganda on Facebook at scale for pennies. And that continues. Look at a lot of stuff that's happening in probably your local elections here. And so I think it's going to take us a long time to figure out, whoa, what the hell? We just went on some bender, and we need to like clear our minds and figure out, how do we fix this? How do we regulate it? How do we self-regulate? How do we put part of this genie back in the bottle? Otherwise, you're just going to continue to see this pattern. By the way, whether Trump exists or not, others will just utilize the same tools.
Good news for my Facebook newsfeed is I mainly get Axios news. So.
Well, that's good. All right. That's real news. There you go.
Axios and The Onion. It's like alternate.
You had me at the first part, buddy.
You just had to go. Did you want to share an experience of when you first started to realize that it was a bigger problem on Facebook or the social platform?
Well, journalists have always had the responsibility to act ethically, to really and truly check bias at the door. We're all biased. Look, we all are. We bring our experiences. Sometimes it helps us report better because we have some insights or some bias on behalf of something or other. But journalists have always had this responsibility. And when I first started to realize that this fake news that Donald Trump was talking about was gaining some foothold, it was very, very disappointing and alarming. Like some others who majored in journalism, I minored in history with a bit of a concentration on Germany and Nazi Germany. And in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler called it Lügenpresse, which means lying press. Well, it worked very well for Adolf Hitler. He silenced the communist media. He silenced any of his opponents, and what he had left was his propaganda arm. Now, look, I am not one to try to take this too far, but when you think about history and you think about what's happening in this country, and you think about, I think there's a USA Today poll out of, okay, this was Republicans, almost half believe that President Trump should have the ability to shut down news outlets. where does that playbook come from? What does it remind you of? What can we learn from history? It's very alarming, and it's very disappointing. But I don't think, and this may be a question that you're going to get into, I don't think the media is blameless here. I don't think that the way the media is handling things is absolutely correct by any means. The media response and the media and the way some media are acting. So we may get into that later, but it's a complicated subject right now. But it's scary.
I think we've laid out pretty good context, personal stories and opinions about the situation. How do you think we should fix it? Any of you can take this up.
Not it.
Toughest question of the day.
Yeah.
So do
Is
you wanna
there a
put
way
in
to
some-
fix it?
How do we chip away at it?
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that the media can control and some that the media cannot control. For one thing, I think I'm not sure how well history is taught anymore in our schools. I'm not sure how well civics is taught in the schools. A while back, there was a survey done of high school teachers that got into how much do you teach civics and how much do you teach about the Constitution. And it really wasn't a whole lot. And then it had declined over time. And then they got into asking the high school students about this. And most of the high school students said, this is across the country, thought the First Amendment had gone too far. First Amendment guarantees too much. Most of the students thought flag burning was illegal. Well, I'm not going to burn a flag. Maybe nobody in this room is going to burn a flag. We'd think that was horrible. But that's part of free speech. It's not actually illegal, and it shouldn't be as long as we have a constitution that upholds free speech. So that's something we can't control, but I hope that our education, and even at this level, at the college level, from the media standpoint, I think the media has to start acting like we're not partisans. And I'm especially talking about networks, major networks. And I'm not just talking about President Trump's personal show, Fox and Friends, and some of the mouthpiece aspects that Fox News has. Fox News does have some really good journalists on balance. They've retreated to one corner and taken a lot of viewers with them. But CNN, MSNBC, there is not a pretense of objectivity anymore, even from the anchors. And so I think that's got to be addressed. I think Professor Phelock calls it pandering. Well, that is, you're pandering to an audience. You're not really covering issues that are important to an audience. You're not getting deep enough into the issues. I think the media has to get back to that. And the last thing is, I think the media has to review how stories are accurate in both fact and context. Context really matters. A story can have all the facts right and still be wrong if the context is wrong. And I think that there's too much surface coverage of politics now, and not enough that gets into the context. And the last thing that occurs to me, at least sitting here right now, is that the media have to be aware of the range of stories they're covering. There are, and it may be the short term, there are some really good things happening with the economy. Depending on how you feel about the military is being modernized, there's some things going on that are not getting much coverage, except on Fox News. And so I think the media has kind of retreated to its own corner, left or right, brought a lot of viewers with them, a lot of screamers, and I think that there's some pandering going on rather than covering issues.
Just a few things to add. I think some of it goes back to who's consuming the news. Where do you go to get the news? And, I don't think some adults understand the difference in the different media. We're all lumped in together, and sometimes it takes watching various news or reading various newspapers to get a overall view of what's really going on. So I think it's on the consumer side. I also think, I think the newspaper business, the media business does a pretty good job. If it makes a mistake, they generally correct it. But of course, those people are then called out for leading the news. So it's not going to be easy. People are too polarized these days. If there was an easy answer, it would be done.
The thing I'll add is there's 4 things that none of them will happen that if they did happen would change it overnight. And it would start with politics, technology, reporters, and then us as individuals. So in politics, we've got to demand that our leaders just stop with the fake news nonsense, right? We have to, there has to be and it won't happen until post-Trump. It's too effective of a technique for him, but that has to go away. People have to understand that you need a free press. It's one of the things that makes us a much more vibrant and effective, both democracy and capitalistic system. So that's one. 2, if it were up to me, all reporters should be banned from talking about anything other than sharing their stories on Twitter. I think Twitter has destroyed journalism. Reporters say stuff about that betrays their views on Twitter that they never would have said on TV, and I would have been fired for saying when I worked at the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal a decade ago. So if people could get off of Twitter. 3, I think the social media companies, either by regulation or by self-regulation, they have to be treated like media companies. They have to be much more responsible for the content and the garbage that's often coursing through their algorithms. I think if they did that, that would be effective. And then 4, and people don't want to hear this, you're to blame, at least partly. I know what you read. I look at the data. It ain't pretty. You like garbage. You laugh. You do. Know what you're reading. We want to blame everyone else. There's such awesome news sources out there in any area. There is just awesome information everywhere at your fingertip. Stop consuming garbage. Know what you're reading. Facebook is not a news company. When you say, I read that on Facebook, you read it on Facebook, but it's not from Facebook. There's a difference between the New York Times having something that gets in your feed and then some weird company you've never heard of that either makes you mad or emotional or laugh. Know what you're reading. You own that. 60% of people share stories without reading them. I don't know. Stop doing that. That might be a start. But I do think we all own a piece of this. These are really cool technologies that do awesome things. I don't mean to dog on Facebook. I have a critique of its effect on politics. But it also allows my mom to see what my kids in Alexandria, Virginia are doing. It does beautiful things. But these are new toys, and so far we've been playing with these new toys pretty irresponsibly.
I want to add, one of the things I talk about in class is the stories about the kids from Macedonia who are creating these fake news sites and going on Facebook and with the Google the advertising, they're making $20,000 a year when the average salary in Macedonia for the year is $361. They're going to keep doing it because they know the Trump and the Hillary Clinton, and especially during the election, gives them money. So. Anything else?
I have one major final question, and then I guess we can open it up to the public for any other questions. But ending more on, a brighter note, moving forward, what do you think the future of journalism looks like in your eyes?
Go first.
I still think we're in the middle of a lot of disruption. I would have thought that 4 or 5 years ago the disruption was peaking. It's not, because what hit newspapers is now going to hit TV. The cable, as you know, it's gone. Whatever the future is, it's more Netflix and Hulu than it is Time Warner Cable and the stuff that we grew up with. And that's going to have a big effect on how we consume information and where we work in media. Listen, I do think it's a bright future for people who want to be in the media space. I still think it is the coolest job you can possibly have. I've yet to meet somebody who has a more interesting job than I do. And by the way, I thought that when I was working at New Fuels Report, and I think it now running a company, you get paid to learn. And I think learning's kind of cool. And I think you get paid to be a mischief maker. Being a mischief maker could be kind of cool too. So it's a great business. Or can be a great business. You just need to know that there's going to continue to be tons and tons of change. Like in some ways, school, if I'd been here, I think I probably said it 6 or 7 years ago, like journalism school, it wasn't you didn't necessarily need it to be a journalist. Like now you really do. Like the skill sets that you need, there are lots and lots of technical skills that you need because you're going to have to be super agile and versatile. You're going to have to probably move from doing podcasts and some video cutting and text-based to video to whatever 3D or whatever hell's next in terms of our news consumption. So I think it's a fun business to be in. I think that we're little by little sorting out what models work. I think a positive trend is that more and more people do seem willing to pay for high quality content, which I think bodes well for high quality content news companies. I still think we've got several years of this nonsense to burn off because there's still too much of a perverse incentive built into the social platforms for people to produce kind of nonsense, but that'll fix itself. And then on the other side, I do think and I do hope that we end up where we should be, which is information nirvana. Like we should be 1,000 times smarter than ever before. Like literally, that's what my biggest frustration is. Like we should all walk around getting smarter faster, and I sometimes worry we're getting a lot dumber quicker because we're making the wrong choices. But if you start to make the right choices, there's just awesome content, and it's delivered in a much more effective way. And once you figure out what you can trust, you could be a hyper consumer in news. You don't have to worry about memorizing as much stuff because Google's going to do that for your brain, and you can start to think more creatively about how all these different topics interact. And that's where all the action is going to be. That's where new businesses are going to come from, new conflict, new political ideas, and I think that'll be fun.
I agree with everything he said, but my addition is about the students. I feel pretty confident because I think our students rock, and I'm a little bit, I do feel that way for a reason, but they're smart, they're caring, they really try to get it right. So for that reason, I feel really optimistic. I agree, it's going to take a while, but I see some of the students we have today doing some of the great things that these two have done. And so that leaves me feeling pretty optimistic overall.
How many in the room are journalism majors or are going to pursue a career in journalism? Okay, raise your hand straight. You should be proud of this, so raise them all the way up. How many public relations or marketing track? Okay, you can raise them up too. There's nothing. That's good. That's good. Well, I think I'm pretty optimistic about the future, even though I think we're in a lot of turbulence right now. But what journalists can do, and what the folks in marketing and public relations can do. First, you folks in marketing public relations should know what to expect from journalists. You should expect objectivity, fairness. Sometimes fairness is in the eye of the beholder, but really, are you being fair in this coverage or in this story? You should expect ethical behavior. You should expect journalists that don't break the law or do anything underhanded to get information. You should have a personal relationship. And you journalists, and this is going to sound too simplistic, and I know that, but I don't know what else to say. Do your jobs well. Do them ethically. Be fair. Check your bias at the newsroom door. And to Jim's point about things that would have gotten him fired at the Post, as recently as 3 years ago, when I was the editor and publisher of the Free Press, it still would have gotten you fired. We had a reporter who was on Twitter, and we encouraged this. He tweeted out there was going to be a Detroit City Council meeting that night. It was a contentious issue. One of the controversies was whether some out of open records laws in Michigan had gone off and decided something, and they were just going to kind of swoop in at this council meeting and we're going to vote, and then, okay, that's it. So, so this reporter tweeted and said, Mike, I'm going to be covering the meeting tonight. I'm going to be posting, I'm going to be tweeting. And then he said, and we'll find out if so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so have made sure that the fix is in. Well, okay, this is a reporter covering a city council meeting, and I won't go into any names or the personnel issues that we worked through with this reporter, but this reporter got in some hot water. This was not appropriate. This reporter is there to cover the news and cover the city council, and he showed a bias when he sent out that tweet, and that's not acceptable. You have to, as best you can, and we're all biased, check it at the door, check it at the newsroom door, and go about your job even-handed. Having said that, though, you've got to find the truth. You've got to follow your nose to the truth. And there's a lot of sniffing going on in Washington right now, and that's appropriate. But so it's not like, okay, I'm going to quote her accurately and him accurately, and that's my job. No, your job is to find the truth. And one of the things that's going to serve journalism well, and the reason I'm optimistic, is that I agree. I think we've got great students. I think we've got great students here. We had a really good session earlier today, Kevin and I, and I am optimistic that we're producing the kind of people that are going to go out, whether you're interacting with journalists as marketers or PR, or you're journalists, understand each other, act up and up, get to the truth, and I think that's going to be, over the long term, the answer to solving this issue that we have right now.
Guys, any final thoughts before we open it up for Q&A?
The only thing I'll add is I think the last year we have seen some amazing reporting. I mean, I know I am now going to the New York Times Daily, the Washington Post, and I can't live without Mike's column in Axios every morning. That's the first thing I look at. So there's more good reporting out there, and I just wish I could get others to read it. So I think overall the media has upped its game a little bit. So,
Guys, any questions from the crowd? In the back in the blue?
We talked a little bit about how fake news has become a term, or sort of equate with news coverage that you're not happy with. Do you think that that's still the best term to describe it, or do you have any suggestions for other terms? Do we stick with the term fake news, knowing that some people will abuse it, or do we find a different term to describe disinformation and try to maybe make that a little more mainstream?
go for it.
I mean, once the genie is out of the bottle and this term is out there, it becomes complex and difficult. If I were an educator, I would probably try not to use the term fake news. Or if I were talking about fake news on broadcast or writing about it, I would try not to use the term fake news to cover to refer to everything that's false out there. I mean, there's a big difference between the label that Trump has applied to mostly credible journalism, just what he doesn't like, and a Photoshop picture of Republican leaders standing, appearing to use the white supremacist sign, Photoshop. There's a big difference between this falsehood and this bogus and what Trump calls fake news. And I think the more we conflate them, I think the more we can kind of differentiate, and I don't have exactly the answer on how to do that, but I think the more we conflate those two examples under the one label of fake news, I don't think we're serving ourselves well.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is just try to be precise. Like fake news, like again, like it is kind of a marketing term. Like, and the reason for precision is that there is a big difference. Like state-sponsored misinformation or disinformation, like is really important for people to understand what that is. To understand like why are the Russians doing that, or the Chinese doing that, or the Iranians doing that. That's different from someone running an ad that's sort of flimsy or false. And like I think you want to be very clear in what that is. So the more precise you can be with your language, I think the better for everyone, because there's propaganda, there is disinformation, there is purposely misleading information. There's like a whole scale of them, and I think you just have to be very precise.
Yes, Brown.
Yeah, so I'm not a journalist, I'm a political science major, so I kind of look at things in a more political context. But I guess like the core of the issue seems to be kind of creating a false equivalency between like intellectually dishonest reporting and like actual like quality journalism. You have one outlet that wants to just like I guess throw out kind of poor quality reporting, and then it's being equated to the New York Times or something. And a part of this is just because of how we interact with media on social media. And so I was just wondering, how do you feel that this needs to be something that's dealt with kind of as a media company? Do media companies need to deal with this kind of false equivalency, or is this something that should be hashed out and by the public essentially?
It'd be very hard to do it in totality, like because your definition of false equivalency is going to be different than his definition of false equivalency. So it's very hard. You kind of have to do it at the organizational level or at the individual level. Like where we usually deal with false equivalency in journalism is the sort of the he said, she said nature of coverage, which often I sort of agree with the critics on this. I think it's often useless. Like there's some things just are what they are. Like we can argue about man's contribution to the Earth warming in consecutive years, going back 15, 16 years, but you can't really dispute that the Earth is getting warmer and that human beings have some contribution to that. Sure, maybe some on the left exaggerate it, maybe some on the right deny it, but like some things just are what they are. They're tethered to like real facts, and you kind of have to work from that basis. And so like there's some times where false equivalency then creates a false reality in terms of like, well, what is it that we're actually dealing with? But again, like that's where it's on, in some ways it really is on you. You will see over time the individual reporters and the news organizations that you can trust. If you want, very easily, just follow them and then see kind of what happens. How often do they get it right? How often do they get it wrong? How often does it seem like they're putting too much spin on the ball? It'd be very obvious. And the most of the big companies that your Wall Street journals, the one thing I will say to the people who are always like, oh, there's so much liberal bias. There's no doubt in my mind, having been in all these newsrooms, that 80 to 90% of reporters on True Serum are definitely left of center. That was true 20 years ago. It's true today. What I will say is that certainly until 5 years ago, I very rarely ever saw reporters doing things that were, to me, self-evidently biased. They might not understand sort of the evangelical community, or they might have sort of a rigid view on the abortion debate, and that might skew kind of the quantity of stories you're doing on topics. But when they were going in it, if anything, reporters are, by their nature, for whatever reason, tend to be a very insecure breed, and they would overcompensate for it. I think you saw a lot of overcompensation around the Iraq War. And so I didn't see much bias. Like most reporters, you got to remember, reporting, it's not like most people don't go into reporting because it's super lucrative. In most cases, it's not that lucrative. You're doing it because you feel very passionately about it. And if they wanted to go make money and like just be loud, they could go be an opinion columnist, which might pay more, or they could go be an activist, which certainly would probably pay more. They're trying to get to the closest approximation of the truth. I think that's true. I think where I'm pretty harsh critic of the media is the last 5 years. I just feel, especially with the Clinton-Trump campaign, the number of reporters who are betraying what their personal political views are, that I think are putting at risk their ability to persuade the persuadables that you're trying to get to the closest approximation of the truth, has become highly problematic. It's a long way of answering the question about false equivalency, but to me it goes to just pay attention to this news source that you're going to. If you trust it, if over time it feels right, go to that. Block out the rest of the garbage. You can control all of this. You can control what's in your news feed. You can control who you follow on Twitter. You can control what you Google. You can control what websites you visit. That's 100% in your control. Nobody can mandate that, only you. And that's where, because of that, then you have to own it.
So Jim, you just said something about the he said, she said dynamic. How do you relate to that with the Me Too movement? So if a woman comes to you and has a huge story about a politician or whatnot, how do you corroborate it, or do you just
Right.
your gut?
Well, that's, when I'm talking about a he said, she said, I'm talking about they're sort of like, oh, Republicans said that, Democrats said that. If someone comes forward with an allegation, which they do all the time, you report the hell out of it. And you try to find corroborating sources. And if it's true, you write it. If you write it, there's massive penalties. Like for all the dogging on the press, I mean, the press helped bring about the Me Too movement. There's been tremendous reporting on that. It's basically helped spark, and then obviously women across all these different sectors have risen up, and it's really been sort of I think 20 years from now we'll look back as like a real pivotal moment for the country. So as any media institution, you have a huge obligation and a huge interest in trying to cover those stories. The complexity is, like you saw with the Kavanaugh case, like a lot of this stuff happened a long time ago. A lot of women don't want to come forward. They understand what they're going to go through and the public scrutiny and the Twitter torture that you can often have to endure if you do. Then you have to go and try to corroborate things that happened a long time ago, and that's where it gets difficult. And but with all of those difficulties said, there's been an amazing string of reporting. And by the way, I think you're going to see a lot more of it. There's still a lot of sectors, higher education. I still think there's a lot more to come in Hollywood. Still think there's a lot more to come in technology. I still think we're only at the beginning of that. But you report it like you would report any other story. And then you get to have the consequence of doing that.
Whole bunch.
Jim, you're talking about individuals can control what they consume and what they use. Well, there almost seems to be an addictive nature to social media and news on your phone now, to the extent that people get caught up in it and people send them things and then they read them and they forward it on and they don't have time to like scrutinize what they're looking at, and they're just doing it quickly, and generationally it seems to be younger people, phone is their way of communicating now, and as you get older, it's a little less, but not so much. I mean, we're all stuck on our phones all the time. So, how, if you talk to a group this size, and maybe we all think about it now when we look at our phones, and maybe we will control it, but how do you get to the hundreds of millions of people, How do you make them understand they need to control that?
Well, be careful with my words here. Hopefully my daughter's not watching. I used to smoke, okay? Smoking's terribly addictive. I also figured out it's not healthy for me. No one was going to help me quit smoking. Like, I had to quit smoking for myself.
The Surgeon General told you to stop.
They did. That's where I think you're going to see you have to have a public movement. You might have to have a government movement to explain. Like, again, I don't mean to sound like I'm totally dogging on the social media companies. However, now I'm going to dog on the social media companies. And it's not me. Look at all the truth tellers. Look at all the whistleblowers who've left Facebook, who've left Twitter, who've left these social media companies. They very purposely create colors, pacing, and habits that have the exact same dopamine effect on your brain that having to have a cigarette does. That's just the truth. Again, I'm not dogging. That is exactly what the people who design these products, they sit there and they try to figure out, how do I get you to spend 10 minutes? Then how do I get you to spend 20 minutes? How do I get you to spend 30 minutes? I don't know what the latest numbers are, but most people are spending is like 50 minutes a day on Facebook. Well, the mandate to Facebook is you've probably reached as many people as you're going to reach. You've got to keep growing. How do you grow? There's only one way, is to get you to 55 minutes, to get you to 60 minutes. And so how do you do that? You don't do it with a really substantive piece on the showdown in the Middle East. You do it with garbage, right? You do it with more emotional garbage. You do it with more indicators of like what it is that really gets you hopped up. Because it is addictive. I look at how much time I spend on this thing. It's like insane. And I even rant and rail against it. And I still am on it constantly. Like, I'm super susceptible to it and I'm hyper aware of it. It's going to take people
realizing it probably ended up taking some government regulation, probably will take like health crises that sort of flow from our addiction to it, to realize that we all went on we all sort of grabbed hands, grabbed our phones, and went on an international bender for 15 years. And now we got whoa, we got to sober up.
It's just kind of my view on it.
All right, we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you guys for coming out. Thank you so much for a panel here.
Thank you.